the podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome, dear listeners, to today's episode of our podcast, which is all about potential development, but also always has values as its foundation and aims to provide the right impulses. Today, my guest, I'm especially excited about this, is Anette Moosmüller. I checked. I've known her for almost 20 years now, and we've worked together a lot and shared many experiences. And I'm really glad you're here today, Anette.
Yes, dear Uli, I'm happy too. When you just said 20 years, I could hardly believe it. But it's all the nicer that we get to spend a bit of time together again.
That's right. And we've given it some thought. Ahead of time, but we've also left some room for our conversation to flow and maybe take a few spins here and there. It can turn in different directions too. As for the structure, roughly speaking, we first want our listeners to get to know you. I'll throw out a few facts here. And then you can add to them. It's also quite interesting how we ended up working together. And also where you've helped me along the way. In my professional life. And at some really crucial points, too. And I think that already gives us a good thread to connect you. And our listeners. And then, it's really important to me to move on to the next part. To your company, where you've been working for quite a while now, businessforce. It's a very unique consulting firm. And I want our listeners to really understand businessforce and also grasp the value the company provides. And that basically leads us right into the third part, where we set out to talk about leadership in times of change. We'll see in a moment that businessforce is really active in the field of transformation. And I think that'll give us plenty of material to fill our 30 minutes. So, I'm just going to get started right away. I met Anette in 2005 when I was working at a consulting firm. And that's when you applied for a job. And I hired you on the spot. There was absolutely no question about it. And then we worked on a bait project together. It was an assessment project for an electronics company. I found it really, really fascinating. Neither of us stayed at that company for much longer, but we kept in touch. And then I called you when I was in a tough spot, after realizing early on in my self-employment that I had ended up with a fraudster. And suddenly I had to handle everything on my own. And you helped me set everything up from a communications perspective, with the writing and overall advice as well. We've always stayed in touch, and through businessforce I was able to take part in many projects as well. You also have quite the background. There are a few stations in your career that are definitely worth mentioning, of course, Siemens and the Boston Consulting Group. And yes, if I remember correctly, you also spent many years of your childhood and youth in the US. So, that's why I've brought in a few facts here, if you will. Shall I pass the ball over to you, Anette? What was it like for you, experiencing those two cultures? And then thinking, okay, now I'm heading into my career. What am I actually going to do? How did it all start, Anette?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're referring to my situation, that I spent my teenage years in the U.S. I was in Texas, which is a pretty unique part of the U.S., culturally speaking, I'd say. Not all that different from Bavarian stubbornness, in a way. But to be honest, there really wasn't much for me to think about, whether I should stay in the U.S. or go back to Germany. That was a promise my parents made me agree to it right from the start, before we even moved to the U.S. They said, well, you really only know Germany as a child, and you need to get to know Germany as an adult too. And that's why, when our time in the U.S. was over, you were coming back with us, at least for a while. That was pretty straightforward. And as for my field of study, I ended up studying journalism. Looking back, I think I made the decision without as much factual knowledge as people might have today. With the internet now, you can look things up so easily. And, well, from the US, there really wasn't much you could do back then either. To really find out what exactly to expect there. So there was this green study guide. I don't know if you remember it, but that was pretty much all I had.
And then it all started.
And then it all started. Yeah, exactly. Beforehand, there was an internship required, so I hadn't even applied for that yet either. I just went there and said, I'm here now. I want to do the internship. Then they said, yeah, just stay here. So that. You can't really imagine that today, but in the end, a lot of things just worked out.
Very nice, very nice. And as a journalist, of course, you can do a lot of things, do the classic stuff, or go into the working world, into companies. And maybe you have 3 or 4 more sentences about how things went for you until you finally ended up in consulting.
Well, it was unusual. So during my studies, I realized that an academic career just wasn't for me. There was a really intense debate about methods in communication studies. That didn't really interest me much. And the decline of the media world, right? That had already started back when I finished my studies. So it was already a bit foreseeable that things would only get more difficult there over the coming decades. The internet had just been born, but you could already see it was casting a long shadow ahead. And I just saw my future more in corporate communications on the one hand, but really also within companies themselves. So I was also interested in business communication and so on. So it was clear to me that I wouldn't end up working in editorial offices. So I went to Boston Consulting Group, not as a consultant at first, but actually into the HR department, where I did a lot of international recruiting. And after those years of studying in Germany, I felt drawn back out into the big wide world. And I was able to do that there. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And besides, BCG was a great company back then, and of course, it still is. And that international flair, those really sharp, positive people, after studying in Germany, that was something I was really drawn to, I have to say.
Nice, nice. But at that point, it wasn't consulting yet, but HR, as you said, which is also something we have in common. I also worked in recruiting, and then you moved over to the consulting side. You also became self-employed, did that as well, and always did these things in communications on the side, but with a lot of insight and experience from the corporate world itself. And you also got into coaching. Maybe you'd like to say something about that as well, because there are coaching certifications everywhere these days. But with you, I have the sense that there was something special about it.
Yes, it was a coaching certification. So I think I was one of the pioneers. That was already at the beginning of the 2000s, 2001, when I did some really intensive research. Back then, there really weren't that many providers. And I already knew I wanted to do something near Munich. And that's when I came across Bodwin Vermaelen. He was just such a character, a real oddball. And he saw the world from totally different perspectives, and that really fascinated me. Also, the way he, as a Dutchman, reflected on and mirrored the Germans was really interesting. And sometimes it was actually pretty funny, too. And that drew me in because I thought, I can really learn something from this. And it's more than just a method, it's kind of a method and a spirit.
Yeah, and broadening your horizons.
Yeah, exactly.
You were just about to add something, so I interrupted you.
Yeah, so. He always said that change in people happens on a lot of different levels. So it's not just the cognitive level, it's also the emotional level. And it even goes as far as the physical level, where relaxation techniques or things like that play an important role, for example, to help you take the next step. To observe what's happening in my body when I'm going through certain experiences. And that's what he did. I think he was really the first to bring all that together in a really good way and say, well, the effectiveness is higher when you address all levels. And that just made sense to me.
Well, I mean, the combination of consultant and coach is, I think, also something that's useful at businessforce. That's why I'd like to dive into that topic now. I can't quite remember how you ended up at businessforce, but if I remember correctly, You were actually the one who brought me to Business Force. And you've been around for 20 years now. I checked out your new website. It looks really great. You support transformations in companies in a holistic way, among other things. You've also received multiple awards from Brand One, Süddeutsche, and so on. You once put it quite nicely, calling it a kind of hidden champion. We have a lot of those in Germany, but maybe not so many in this particular field. That's why it's important to me that the listeners really understand what Business Force is all about. Maybe we should start by asking some questions. Why do customers even come to you in the first place? What are the reasons for that? These days, people call everything a transformation. In the past, people used to call it change management and similar things. So, for what reasons do customers approach you?
Yeah, that's a good observation, Uli. So, for about 5 to 7 years now, I'd say, suddenly everything has become a transformation, whereas before it was just called change. Nowadays, everything gets labeled as transformation, doesn't it? But we interpret it in a much narrower sense. So, customers come to us when they have business-critical situations that simply can't go wrong. For example, it could be that they're changing their business model. Usually, these are also large organizations, and when a reorganization is coming up, meaning making major changes to their organizational structures. Some companies come to us when they're under pressure, when their financial situation isn't so great anymore. When they're thinking about acquiring another company, or have already done so. When they no longer want to handle part of their value creation themselves, but want to outsource it. That's what it's called. Outsourcing. So these are all major changes. There's a lot at stake in these situations. And then, when all this is happening in a complex environment, also in terms of interests, you might have to ask yourself as a board member, can I even do this? Is this even a path I can take? Will the committees go along with it? How do I discuss something like this with my works council? Will everyone take to the streets or something? So, that's when we're good partners, I'd say.
Yeah, I was able to experience that in a few projects, but you also gave me some advice yourself. My company was under pressure once too and went through a major change, and I found that extremely helpful because you really do get that tunnel vision. You're under stress, your cortisol is up, and it's about people in your company, people you might not be able to keep. And so on. And having that clear outside perspective, one that doesn't overlook anything, is incredibly important. That's just one example. I mean, obviously, lately you've been hearing things about the big corporations again, VW and so on, which play a huge role in Germany. So, I think under pressure, speaking from my own experience, I found it fantastic. On the other hand, it's probably also pressure for you as consultants, because you end up under a bit of pressure yourselves, of course. Because that kind of pressure isn't always predictable or manageable. Sometimes it is, sure. But there are definitely situations where you're called in as the firefighters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a time when that played a pretty big role, too. Of course, that basically also depends a bit on the economic situation at times. But there are also situations, like, we really noticed the whole push towards agility in companies. That was a completely different reason, though. But it also led to, well, let's say, a huge need for conversations, discussions, and organization within companies, because it changed the whole understanding of leadership, as well as the way people work together with clients and so on. We've also spent a lot of time working with IT companies. In those cases, agility was, and still is, a major topic. So basically, transformation can take many forms, and the reasons for it can be very different, but you can definitely feel the tension within the company.
Yeah, you have to be able to handle that, but I think if you're experienced and have seen a lot, then you can really bring a lot of value by approaching these things with a steady hand. What really stands out about you is this: holistic support. That was actually one of the reasons I was able to participate in projects, because I could also bring something special to the table. What exactly does that mean? Are you multidisciplinary? Or how would you explain this holistic approach?
Well, you can explain the holistic approach in different ways. This multidisciplinary aspect you just mentioned basically means nothing more than that we originally chose different professions, or rather, different fields of study. So some are lawyers, others study business administration, others studied computer science, have a strong technical background, or are engineers. I studied journalism and communication studies, so psychology as well. So these are fundamentally very different training professions where you look at different. You've looked in different directions. Of course, all of us have worked in management consulting at some point, in different firms, big and small. Some of us were more generalists, others more specialized, so it really varies. That's one thing, that we bring different perspectives. But the other thing is that we also know that a transformation requires a wide range of skills to organize it. So that's what we mean by holistic, that we don't just want to limit ourselves to the PowerPoint level, so to speak, but that we really want to implement it within the company. And the other thing, of course, is that positioning is a completely separate discipline. So we also consider, how will this plan change actually be received? Or rather, is it even feasible? Is it feasible from a political standpoint as well? Will it be accepted, or does it actually need to look different? In order to be implemented, because what we really don't want to do is treat change management like objection handling. You've worked a lot in sales as well. You know all about objection handling. And that's not what we mean by creating acceptance. Instead, you actually have to do that beforehand. Think about what exists in the landscape of interests. In other words, the stakeholders. What does that actually look like, and where do they want to go? And does that fit with the transformation goal?
Yeah, that's what in sales you would technically call objection preemption, so to speak. But you're absolutely right. As you said, the stakeholders need to be on board and they need to be motivated. They need to be offered opportunities. Those are the points you always see there. But I also clearly remember something you said. When you come in and transformation has to begin, it's uncharted territory for almost everyone. And this idea of autopilot becomes useless then. I actually find that really fitting because people are running on autopilot in their day-to-day work, but often they're just running, so to speak, at full speed in their daily routines. And then transformation comes along, for which autopilot is also useless. So, I really think that's true. It's not just essential to really get people on board, but it's also very difficult. From your experience, what can you share? What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's about creating awareness that you have to set the autopilot aside for a bit now. Or that you have to put the day-to-day operations aside. Transformation doesn't happen if you don't make time for it. Especially as a leader, you really have to make time in your calendar to think ahead, to reflect, to organize things, to consider, somehow, what the new way will actually look like and what needs to happen for it to become reality. That's really important. You need something that takes it from PowerPoint, so to speak, into real life. And you have to organize that. And suddenly, maybe completely different or new departments in the company have to work together. The processes have to be designed first. People need to know what their own contributions are. So, you really have to talk about that.
And
Pieces also have to fit together, and they have to be in the right sequence, meaning they also have to line up on the timeline.
I also had the opportunity to support a major transformation at a medium-sized pharmaceutical company. And I always tend to come at things from the people side of things. And what we did there was really open up a lot of opportunities. especially when it came to leadership positions in the second tier, so that time could be freed up for the key players. And if you plant and understand this as an opportunity within the company for people to be able to grow faster now into positions of responsibility, then it often felt a bit like a boost. At least that was my impression.
Yes, absolutely. So that's really great when something like that works out. So when the change, so to speak, creates a positive atmosphere or is created by it. And that kind of pioneering spirit, and also something like, yeah, we can do this. Often, there are fears associated with it, or sometimes you just can't really imagine what the new thing will be like. And that's why I think people reject it, because they can't picture it yet.
They just can't. Yes, exactly.
You often have to actively counter that a bit, somehow with a positive attitude. I don't want to say work against it, but you have to highlight the positive and make it something people can experience. And
Actually work towards that. Maybe that's the better
word if
you want to put it that way. You just mentioned positive attitude already. That's a value in itself, too. And our podcast is called Values, Impulses as well. So, of course, now comes the inevitable question, but one I really like to ask in these transformation processes. What role do values actually play in all this?
Well, values are everywhere. We've already talked about the different occasions, and of course there are situations where values are immediately put under pressure. Think about efficiency programs, restructuring, outsourcing, where parts of the company are, so to speak, spun off or sold, or something like that. The right to belong. Somehow, that's what you have when you sign an employment contract, a kind of perceived right to belong. That automatically comes under pressure, just because of the situation itself. And the other thing, of course, is that values also play a big role in how I shape this transformation. What we've noticed is that transparency is becoming more and more important. These days, you can hardly do anything without transparency and participation. Back in the day, it was all about the Big Bang. Basically, you called all the employees together, stood up there as the board, and announced it. That's how it was. And this is what's going to happen, and this is how it's going to go, and that's the target vision, and so on. That's
Wise.
actually not the case anymore. And it was only a small group of selected or chosen people who had insight into it. You just can't do it like that anymore these days. Those are two important values you should keep in mind when tackling a transformation today. That you organize a high level of participation and make things very transparent. Just as an example, during the COVID period, a company I had the chance to work with changed a lot. And then they said, well, all employees can dial into these central calls where the next steps and further actions are discussed.
Cool.
Everyone.
Wow, okay. So, what was the reaction to that?
That was pretty funny. So for the first 2 weeks, we kept having onlookers, and then suddenly, we didn't have any more.
That's actually the best news, then, the trust, and, yeah, I don't have to spend my time on it. But just having the option to join in, to listen in, and very deliberately, we're opening all the doors. Honestly, it doesn't get any better than that. It's a great way to anticipate objections, if I may say so, because it takes the wind out of their sails. We're doing this, and we're being completely transparent. That's true, of course. And that leads me directly to the topic of leadership. You already mentioned the agile way of working earlier, and leadership is, of course, fundamentally important in transformation. But agile isn't just for where it originally came from, software, IT, and so on, these days. Many leaders, in my experience as well, find it difficult. But what are your observations now, if we take a look at leadership and how it has changed? Looking at the recent past.
So maybe, just in general, what I've noticed is the tone of communication. Even all the way up to the executive board level, it's become more relaxed.
Nice.
Also, what I've noticed as well is that Topics like diversity, inclusiveness, and sustainability, which, let's say, 10 years ago were maybe seen more as just window dressing, have really become part of the leadership DNA and are now a natural part of everyday leadership. That's one thing I've noticed. And the other thing, now looking at leadership specifically, is the significant change when it comes to change itself. The pace has really picked up a lot over the past 10 years. So this idea that you have a stable status quo, then comes the transformation, and then you return to another stable state, B, and then you have established routines and processes again, and for a while, change is over. Yeah, that feeling of we've accomplished something and we've now reached this goal. And now things will just go straight for a while. That's becoming more and more rare, and in some industries, it feels like it doesn't even exist anymore. So when transformation program A is 80% done, the next one is already knocking at the door. You
Once said that the finish line is missing. The finish line.
The finish line.
But what does that do to people? And maybe that's about company culture, but maybe also national culture. That's a factor that plays a role. Surely, some companies handle it better than others, right? Have you noticed anything about that? Maybe not empirically, but just from your impression.
Well, it could be, of course, that. Let's say German cultures and maybe even specific sectors within certain industries are even more likely to hope that there are these finish lines, these endpoints. Okay, we've made it. The marathon is over now. Now we can finally take a bit of a break. But of course, there are also industries, especially IT, I'd say, where people will tell you themselves, IT never really finishes. They've been working this way for much longer, in project structures, or change happens through projects. So, in the regular line operations, there's actually very little change happening. So, yeah, I think you really have to look at it industry by industry, and it would also be interesting to see how a French company handles it. How do they see it? I don't have much experience with that myself. But I'm curious, how do Spanish companies deal with it, Uli?
Well, I'm not that deeply involved either, but after 25 years of working internationally in companies, I do have some experience. And before that, I was already working internationally. So, I'd say it definitely depends on the industry, but it's also specific to the country and region, and even to the company's structure. Company size obviously plays a role as well. And when I look at German SMEs, that's something different than a large corporation. If I think about which group stands out as the most flexible, especially when we look at different countries, I'd say the Americans are quick and good at what they do. They try things out, take action, and so on, but sometimes they're also very quick in ways that, in Germany, we'd say, no, that's not how we want to do it. For example, if I just mention hire and fire as a keyword. But for example, Benelux, especially the Dutch, I find them incredibly agile, if I can put it that way, and the Scandinavians as well. But maybe we shouldn't write off the German-speaking region either, at least that's what my experience tells me. I've had very, very good experiences working with the Swiss, even though that kind of goes against their national image. But they are very, very progressive in many areas, and Austrians as well, so sometimes you get the impression that maybe smaller nations, let's leave the USA out of this, find it a bit easier to be agile than the big tankers. That's speaking independently of industries and company structures. Those are my impressions, anyway. Would you like to add anything to that, maybe?
I think I need to give that some more thought first. I also don't want to start bashing Germany now.
No, absolutely not. I've done a lot of assessment interviews where I keep saying to myself, wow, things are really moving in a very, very good direction. You mentioned the changes in leadership, so maybe to wrap up, it's nice to say that there are basically two logics in companies, the beautiful agile world rarely exists in its purest form. People try, so to speak, to get there, but the hierarchy isn't completely gone. Yeah, that's the kind of tension that comes up. And how do you feel about that, maybe as a final thought? And what kind of experiences have you had with these two logics?
Yeah, well, These agile teams, they really like to have philosophical discussions. So is this really agile, or is this the wrong kind of agile, or is it agile enough, and so on and so forth. You could honestly discuss that all night. That's one thing. And the other thing is, of course, there's a lot of potential for frustration, because with this move towards agility, there are often, in my opinion, a lot of misconceptions that come with it. First of all, from now on there are no more rules. Everyone can just do whatever they feel like. Secondly, people somehow think, well, now that we are agile, why do I still have to go to a specific committee, for example, to get a budget approved? So then you get situations like that, where suddenly there are fixed deadlines again, meaning things have to be finished by a certain time, which actually goes against the principles of agile work. But on the other hand, there are companies that are regulated where certain things, or where there are legal requirements, to put it simply. So you can't just say, well, we'll just fit that into the sprint in a way that works for us. So I think, to some extent, there's also a bit of the potential for frustration because people imagined agile working differently. I also think there's a misunderstanding that once you're working agile, there will be fewer conflicts. I think that's wrong because conflicts are just part of life, whether you're agile or not.
Agile.
And they need to be resolved, and ideally, they're resolved in a good way by talking things through together and being open. Coming up with ideas, working well together on how to solve a problem. And of course, that can be confusing for leaders sometimes. So, what am I actually still allowed to lead? Or when should I actually say something? Or am I allowed to offer help or not? Yeah, well, I think so. You really have to learn to find your way in this new world, and to stay in dialogue and in contact.
And of course, that's a challenge too. And I think it's a good one. Rules always kind of tempt you to just say, well, I'll just do it and I don't have to make an effort, but I actually think it's a nice challenge. And you described it wonderfully. There's really nothing more to add. Not much to add to that. I just wanted to say in closing that I'm always happy that you regularly use profiling values in your projects and so on, and that you're active in our community as well. And I'm really, really glad that you took the time today and had such an exciting conversation with me about these topics. Dear Anette, thank you so much for your valuable time and the great input.
Dear Uli, the thanks go to you for inviting me, for us having time again to talk. And let's see, maybe 1 or 2 small projects or initiatives will come up where we can work together again on this podcast. That
would make me really happy. Anette, thanks so much for the conversation and see you very soon. Take care. Bye. Bye.
You too. Thanks. Bye.